Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As you see, the press release that announced this result referred to me as a semi-retired radio frequency engineer from rural New Hampshire. So that's my title now. And being retired, I have to admit I'm a little bit out of practice speaking to large groups, and so I may get a little tight in my text here. I apologize for that ahead of time, but at least I've got some colorful slides, and it won't go too fast. I won't go too slowly. I'd like to I'd like to begin by explaining what it was that compelled me to enter the competition, and that will be followed by a brief introduction to the physics of solar events, which will allow me to give you a better idea of how it was that I came up with the winning solution. Finally, I'll close with a few remarks about how the use of challenges and prizes allows the government to tap resources that might otherwise not be utilized. What was it that led me to enter the competition? The short answer is that the problem being posed was one for which it seemed to me some basic knowledge of space plasma physics was almost essential. I'd worked as a theoretical space plasma physicist for many years before changing careers in the mid-1990s to become a radio frequency engineer. So I felt I had at least some of that requisite knowledge. The challenge itself, on the other hand, seemed to be addressed primarily to mathematicians and data scientists. And the announcement even stated that although physicists were encouraged to participate, the seeker believes that some of the most intriguing insights may be gleaned from someone entirely new to the field. Not being entirely new to the field, I was motivated to work very hard on this challenge to show the value of relevant scientific knowledge. You like the way I put that? Okay, the next slide introduces some basic terminology, beginning with the solar flare. And observationally, a solar flare is defined as a sudden localized brightening, both of visible and non-visible parts of the electromagnetic emission from the sun. These emissions extend from radio frequencies at the low end all the way up to X-rays and gamma rays at the high end. And you can think of a flare as kind of a localized explosion on the sun. The energies involved are gigantic, equivalent in some cases to billions of tons of TNT. The next term, solar radio burst, is just a name we give to the microwave portion of this range of emissions. The gigahertz frequencies involved in solar radio bursts are something we can all relate to. They're the radio frequencies used by our cell phones and other wireless devices. On rare occasions, SRBs have direct, though usually small, effects on such systems. Next, solar prominence. A prominence is a large, typically loop-shaped feature that sometimes appears on the sun after a solar flare. You've seen an example of this already in my title slide. The loop in that example extended outward by a distance of about 10 times the Earth's diameter. We'll see a video clip of that event in just a minute. Next, the coronal mass ejection, or CME. That's a huge mass of plasma that shoots outward from some solar flares and continues outward into the interplanetary medium. Sometimes CMEs collide with the Earth's magnetic field and produce what's called a geomagnetic storm. That's when we get the strongest auroral activity. Strong current surges can also be produced on electric power lines then. In March of 1989, such currents tripped circuit breakers on Hydro-Quebec's power grid, resulting in a major outage. Finally, we come to solar proton events, and that was the actual event that I was trying to predict in this competition. I meant to include the abbreviation SPE on this slide, but I forgot to. But I'll be referring to SPEs later. And they're just high-energy proton fluxes produced either within a flare or, more commonly, in a interplanetary shock wave produced by a coronal mass ejection. So it's a little complicated. We have these different types of phenomena going on, and it isn't always what you think it is. Okay, the next slide shows a solar flare is seen at X-ray wavelengths by an imaging telescope on the Japanese satellite Hinode. Can you start that video for me?
I'm trying, it's not
Okay.
going anywhere.
Well, that's too bad. Okay, well, that's not essential. It's a very powerful event. And you probably saw it on ABC News earlier this year. It was, I think, April 16th of this year that event happened. Next slide shows an artist's conception of a basic plasma physics phenomenon known as magnetic reconnection. And the inset at the upper left depicts a so-called magnetic neutral point, where upward-directed magnetic fields on the left are brought into contact with downward-directed magnetic fields on the right, essentially canceling one another out. I won't go into detail, but calculations show that tremendous amounts of energy can be released from the solar magnetic field in this way, enough energy to produce the solar flare. Now, it turns out if you want to build a very simple model of that predicts solar flares, turns out you can do that just by looking for conditions that occur before or during magnetic reconnection. And as we've just seen, that involves oppositely directed magnetic fields in close proximity to one another. And it turns out that solar radio bursts are a good tool to identify that signature, because it just turns out that they have the property that waves emitted from regions where the magnetic field is directed away from us tend to rotate in a clockwise sense. That is, they have what's called right-hand circular polarization. Waves emitted from regions where the magnetic field points toward us rotate in the opposite left-hand sense. Solar radio telescopes routinely measure the left and right-handed parts and their difference. That's just what this simple model requires for input data. The data I used came from the Nobayama radioheliograph in Japan, and that instrument has 84 of these 0.8 meter dish antennas arranged in a T configuration. Using data from this instrument, I was able to demonstrate a 1 day in advance forecast success rate of 75%, with very high statistical significance, exceeding the challenge requirements. In closing, open innovation prizes offer a unique way of accessing resources that might otherwise not be utilized. That's my cat Sparks in the background. Having recently retired from Sprint Nextel, I was obviously well outside the space physics community, yet I had domain knowledge that turned out to be useful. My more recent experience in applied data or application-oriented data analysis was also helpful in that it made me somewhat less of a perfectionist in the model building process. I know back when I was a scientist, I always wanted to do things that impressed my fellow scientists and get every detail worked out. And that's not always what you want to do if you want to do practical things. And so I think that helped me being out of that having moved on. Thank you.
So we're going to just take the seats up here and take Q&A from the audience and get some more of your questions answered. So any questions?
From both sides of the winners and the contest producers, how are you doing your work to disseminate out to find the collaborators around this space, and for you that have received that have won prizes? How did you find out about the prize? Is that something you're constantly doing? It's something like, how do you find the populations and communities that you want to connect with?
I could take that from our perspective. Again, ours are really big, so we often will have to actively search. So on our prize teams, we actually have a full-time team relations manager that goes to conferences, publishes stuff, looks around, tries to identify the right people, tries to convince them. You know, on some of our prizes, we have a little bit of a hard time getting people to compete because we're bigger companies, and trying to convince them. So that's what we normally do, a lot of marketing and media and actual recruitment.
So just one follow-up from me. We didn't do any marketing. We used the companies as is because they were pilot programs, and so we wanted to try the incentive and the top coder networks. Now that we have that kind of experience, though, we would do marketing to broaden the base that can come in and tap to that field. So you're not limited to the solvers signed up. In fact, the platforms would usually encourage you to push people of a particular background or knowledge base, perhaps, that might be able to solve problems. So in the future, we would actually expand that network.
Yeah, we found out about the XPRIZE competition, I think, from the trade show and in the media. So yeah, that's when we became aware of it, and I believe that there were some sessions held at one of the conferences where you introduced the competition. So that's where we learned about it.
I think I had signed up already with incentive before the challenge, but I hadn't entered any other challenges. I think I actually saw the announcement on Facebook the first time.
And just wanted to add one other thing. If you do large prizes, like we tend to do, when we design a prize, we end up working with over 100 people, and we try to talk to all the potential stakeholders, and one set of those stakeholders are potential competitors, because we have to figure out that how fast we're going to push the industry, those dials I was talking about. But also, we need to make sure people are going to show up. And if we make it too hard, nobody's going to show up.
And I think the lesson here is that the platforms that exist, from XPRIZE to Top Coder to Incentive, already have a lot of expertise. And so you're not starting at de novo. You should basically tap into one of these platforms and help them accelerate what you want to get done.
Question here. Just based on everything I've heard thus far, it always seems there's a logic to this, that you need to go outside the agency or the company or whatever, find an outside edge or entities, A, to do the solving, but B, to bring it together. Does it always have to be that way? Because these companies, you know, they're making money doing this. Is there some way to bring a portion of this inside of the agency so some of it can, like NASA can do one directly, or smaller ones, or, you know?
Yeah, so to answer that question, what I don't have up on that slide, and I should, is our version of that 4-quadrant model that Gary Pisano put together. Because there are a lot of problems, A, that we went through this analysis, we kept internally. We felt the expertise was inside. We did it a little out of sequence, but then we also have NASA at Work set up, which are to run internal challenges. So our first premise now, as a model going forward, is run the challenges internally first and see who we connect internally. Even if we get a result, great. If we don't get a result, probably informs us better about going outside. And we wouldn't necessarily go outside with a prize. We're still using prizes as one of several tools, small business proposals, grants, and everything else. So we want to do this very deliberately and sequentially in the future.
There is also an issue, we work with this myself at NASA, of privacy amongst the crew and so forth, that they get really squeamish talking about anything. And if you're trying to deal with group health with a small population, I would think you'd want to really have some of these tools completely inside your, firewall.
Yeah, and so far we haven't done anything with health data per se. This has been with like point solution technology prizes to augment our systems that we have.
I think it's important to know that, I mean, what Jeff had already as a base was sort of this portfolio process of mapping the problems they need to go after and a sense of what the gaps were. So anybody that wants to do this beyond just a one-off thing, you want to actually start thinking of the challenges that exist in the organization as in terms of a portfolio. You say, okay, what are the things that I need to get solved? How far away am I from solving them? And then decide which is the better approach. So I think that's the critical step that I think that needs to be taken. The second thing is that this is deeply threatening to the people inside the organization. Right? People say, "What? I'm a rocket scientist. Come on, I'm at NASA. What's going on?" So you have to sort of recognize sort of the internal resistance you'll get. than to try to do this yourself. And just be prepared for that. Walk in with your eyes open that in fact there will be, especially from your technical experts, a lot of resistance around this and know how to deal with that. The upshot is that, you know, in our research, we find that after the contest, the people that resist the most come back and say, I've learned so much more now about the field that I never would have been able to help myself, to know myself before. And that makes a big difference. And you have to, you know, if you're going to go this route, which NASA has gone this route, is would then say, you need to build up capability inside the organization to define, abstract problems, and to think through the challenges that way.
Yeah, so just to add to that, I mean, our culture change effort is really to push that these are tools in a toolkit, and they're not there to replace anything else. And we're not saying they're superior a solution mechanism than other things, but they fit, and we think they fit in deliberate places. I'll give you an example. They can fit with the other tools. You could run an ideation challenge before you put out an SBIR or before a grant, if you want to maybe broaden your understanding of that space before you write it, just as an example. So they don't necessarily have to be at the end of the line, just on point solution problems that can fit within the life cycle of a project.
I guess could you, any of the panelists kind of expand on that? You know, I'm working in strategic planning for long-term R&D for energy technology, and you know, where do you think this this option of prizes and challenge kind of fit in with sort of long-term technology development projects?
Chris?
Sure. So I think, are you also giving out grants and contracts and all that?
Similar type of
Okay.
situation.
So again, it's one tool in the toolkit. But in terms of long-term planning, it depends on how big of a challenge you want to do, right? So you could do something like Wendy Schmidt in 18 months, or a Centennial Challenge pretty quickly, right? Or you could do something that you really want to push it, and you want to incentivize somebody to do something 5 years out or 7 years out or whatever it is. That the more audacious you make it, the more expensive it's going to be for people to compete, so you're going to get fewer people. But there's certain things like, you know, people always want to do agricultural prizes, right? And by definition, an agricultural prize to increase the yield of something is going to take time because you have to wait for the plants to grow. I mean, so
Unless you're a prize.
unless you figure out how to prize how to make the plants grow quicker. So I think it just depends on what your end goal is, right? And I'm not giving you a very clear answer, but I think that the summary is that you can design a prize however you want, if you want it to be an incremental step or a long-term step, or a kind of a revolution, and that could take anywhere from a year to however long you want it to be. So you can just slide it into your planning.
Yeah, I think this afternoon, especially if you go to a variety of the sessions, you know, they run everywhere from an ideation challenge that we've talked about that can run for 30 days and be $5,000 to a market stimulation prize, like a lot of the X prizes where you're actually trying to build a new market or stimulate a new community. So you kind of got to step back and ask that first question of, you know, what are we trying to do? And that can be from the tactical to the strategic. And so I think that analysis really has to be done first.
Yeah, and I think that the framework you're going to sort of take is, so what the X Prize does, it sort of goes after audacious goals that we didn't think were possible, and they try to build out systems. So a system to collect oil, you know, spaceship, and so on, and that will bring in actors that are basically firms and who are competing in that size. But then you can also sort of say, if you sort of think about the key roadblocks that we think we're facing in technologies for energy, and you can pick off smaller components, and you can say, well, that I could take off and try to get it solved independently. So you can do the whole spectrum, but you need to have a point of view about what the specific challenges are, and get folks in your technical community to start brainstorming around what the different challenges are. We ran something for the NIH recently on lung cancer screening recently to really sort of push through how you could actually analyze CT data to help think about if there's cancer or not in these scans. And it really was a multi-party, two-day discussion with experts to sort of say, what is the actual problem we're trying to solve, and what are all the technical components that are going to be behind that. And that has resulted now in us recommending close to 6 different challenges to solve that problem.
Just to add one more thing, I think a related question that you really have to ask yourself is, what do you have the ability to do? Because if we launched a prize and we said it's going to be a $10 million prize, we make sure we have all that funding at the very beginning. Of course, we always fall short and we have to, oh, this marketing campaign costs too much and we have to go find something else. But the teams need to believe that money's going to be there. And I know a lot of agencies have that problem holding on that money for, 5 years or whatever it is.
So I run Good Magazine Challenge platform, and we really focus on small prizes that everyday people can participate in to drive social impact. And so we create hundreds of losers every month as well. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what do you do after a challenge closes? Are there sort of consolation prizes, or do you folks a title, or are there perks just for participating in the challenge you presented?
Sure. I don't mean to hog the mic. We try to celebrate everybody. So we have big award ceremonies and we bring them in. We bring the best stories to our events. But again, we're big, right? And one of the more important things we try to do is we try to recognize what is, if there's a front runner, how do we get other people to compete, right? So I'm switching it on you a little bit, but for example, we designed a autonomous automobile competition, which we'll probably launch. We're close to funding it. But everybody thinks Google's the front runner, right? Because they have all the vehicles on the road and you see it in the paper all the time. And so we had to create a second place prize that was pretty substantial so that people would keep continuing. So we always have some other levels of prizes to get people in. And then at the end of it, we try to showcase all the stories, at least of the top ones, right? We're not going to showcase 50 stories, but we try to get everybody press interviews. We try to get everybody involved if it has a good story, right? You might just have complete failure.
So if I may add, also, I think there's buckets of economics, sociology, and psychology to consider when you sort of think about the participants you want to have. So I think most of the sponsors will want lots of entry. And people participate for that. So from an economic point of view, certainly having multiple prizes makes sense, and multiple awards makes sense, because you want the second place person to strive as much and third place person as well to strive as much. From a sociological point of view, we know that people participate because of signaling, because they want to sort of to demonstrate some level of skill or expertise or something to the communities that they belong in. And so finding ways to expose that their participation mattered, even though they did not win, but it mattered, goes a long way. And then part of that also is this notion that I can learn from the winners, and I can learn from the experience itself. So, when I first, with the Top Coder, my entree was from an open source software world where there was no competition, it was all sharing of knowledge all the time. And I come into this very Darwinian winner-take-all types of contests. And what I learned, what they figured out, is that after the contest, there's a tremendous amount of community where people are sharing knowledge and learning from each other. So that actually is a big driver for participation. And that does two things. One is that it keeps people showing up again because they want to learn. In order for me to learn, I need to participate in code. When I code, and then even if I lose, I'm still going to learn about what the best ways are. But then that also builds up the community for further action in the future. And then there's also the sort of the psychological benefits of participation and getting recognition and so on that also matter. So you have to sort of think about it in a holistic way. And while the attention goes to the winners a lot, you want to be thinking about systems and so forth that allow for the signaling and the learning capacities to come through. I was going to ask you, what did you sort of think about, like you were in this competition and you might have lost. So yeah. What was the conversation from at the firm level to sort of say, we're going to still do this and make it happen?
I think it's because we had a new technology, it wasn't on the marketplace already.
Yeah.
So we didn't really have a corner to defend.
Okay.
So it was a win-win situation for us. And that was going to be my comment is, how do you bring big companies who already have some technologies which they, in our industry isn't tremendously regulated. So we have machines which go out there and pick up oil and nobody really checks how well they do it. So you have firms out there who may say on paper, well, we already do it. But the reality might be slightly different. So, my comment or observation would be to the people generating these prizes is, well, how do you bring them to the table without them, running the risk of looking potentially bad when the machine doesn't quite perform or win. So how you solve the problem, I'm not quite sure. They may never want to.
They may not want to, right? They may decide not to do it. And Bruce, so you would sign on to NSF a while before you did this challenge. So what was your initial motivation to sign on to NSF in the first place?
I think it was just when I left space science, I struggled for a while, taught for a while, part-time, and that sort of thing. And I realized that being in academia, I really lacked knowledge of what industry needed. And when I saw incentive, I said, boy, this is a great way to find useful problems, a great way to make yourself useful.
Yeah. And then when you saw the problem itself, I mean, you said the driver was to disprove Jeff and sort of say, it's not just about physicists. But what even sort of gave you the notion that you could even compete? Like what sort of prompted you to say, hey, I'm going to spend the time and effort doing this?
Well, I'd worked on closely related problems, 15, 20 years earlier.
Yeah.
And I thought, why not? There may not be other people who have that combination of experience that I have, and so
it's about the
worth a try.
telecoms as well as. And did your telecoms experience help you with this problem?
To some extent, probably not a whole lot.
Yeah. And then, how much time did you spend on this problem?
Quite a lot. It was a full-time job for the couple months or whatever.
Okay, so like 200 hours?
Probably.
Okay. And Jeff, how much time has been spent within NASA on this problem?
No idea.
But what's your sense? Like, I mean, the effort that has been done before to.
Oh yeah, I mean, we have full-time folks, we have grants and contracts over many, many years, and so that research has been going on incrementally. So this was pretty much a leap ahead, in a very short period of time.
Yeah.
Well, though I would say that if you talk to specialists in solar physics, they might come back and say, hey, we could have done that. Of
course.
If we'd known you'd be happy with that.
I wanted 100%.
It's always easy when you know the answer.
Yeah. And what was the reaction in the community when Bruce showed up with the answer in your heliophysics community?
There was there's some resistance to it, in terms of the answer, because it was using a different methodology. So I mean, it's not atypical to what the internal resistance was.
Yeah. So Bruce basically came with a totally different approach to solving this problem instead of what was done within the NASA community right now. So you can imagine again the pushback from these organizations, because again, their core competencies are threatened. Because this guy with a cat in New Hampshire comes up with what's your cat's name? Sparks comes up with a solution that they have from.
Can you just talk a little bit more about overcoming that resistance? What works? What doesn't work? Is it just proceeding? What do you do to overcome that resistance internally?
If I answer this question, it would imply that we've overcome that resistance. So I think we're partway there in that it is persistence. I think it's belief in that these are effective new tools that can work. One of the things we did, I think, was very effective is we ran a workshop where we did peer-to-peer teaching. So the rest of our folks were hearing from their peers who had run the challenges about what worked, what didn't work. And I think the next step is actually going to be this decision framework where they're truly built in and listed as tools in a toolkit. And I think my folks in particular are ready to try novel approaches, but they just want to see how they fit in and where should they be thinking about using a particular tool. And I think that will go a long way towards further implementation. So, like every other change effort, if in 5 years, people say, oh, we always do business that way, then that's how we'll be able to notice that we've gotten there. But it's a constant process. It's a constant teaching and experience process, and the more people that get involved, the better.
One last question, Doctor.
Just wanted to comment on that. So I ran a similar competition for diagnosing breast cancers a few years back. I'm coming from a private company and running a research lab. There was a tremendous pushback when I did this from the other scientists in my group. Are you trying to lay us off? And so the thing that really helped in the end was two things. One was They got to see the results, which were very different from what we would have proposed, and we got to learn a whole lot of things without trying them all ourselves, which we wouldn't even have thought of. And actually, the more important thing than that is to redefine their roles. Rather than saying we have to come up with a solution, to think of a way to abstract away the medical complexity, to abstract away all the problem details and present a mathematical formalism that people can then go and solve from many different fields. That's a great skill set. That's a very complex and abstract problem-solving ability, and so they saw themselves in a new role. And then the threat vanished, basically.
Yeah, if I could just add to that. So one of the things we're trying to change with our language is that we're looking at all our folks as problem solvers, and so these are just tools for you to go solve problems with. And the folks that ran the challenges were the subject matter experts. So it wasn't an or question, it was an and question. I mean, the subject matter experts in those areas were running the challenges.
This insight that Balaji just presented is actually fundamental because we don't teach right now in our engineering schools or our business schools sort of this problem abstraction skills. We teach them details on how to do problem solving using the tools and approaches of the field that they're part of. And this perspective is actually new and radical and different. And so I think that's why we see a lot of people struggle with this, because we haven't created the language and the science behind how you ask questions. Okay, thank you very much. Time for lunch, and thanks so much for coming, and thanks to the panelists for the great conversations.